You ever had a time when you were in trouble and you needed somebody's help? Maybe a car wouldn't start or a flat tire, you had to cry for help. Well, that's exactly what's happening. Children of Abraham, God's people, have gotten themselves into trouble. They're in slavery. They're being persecuted. And baby boys, young firstborn baby boys, are literally being killed. And they're crying to God for help.
In this session, we are going to be looking at the events of the Exodus found, interestingly enough, in the book of Exodus. And actually, thematically, what we're going to look at is the reality that God's people, being a God person, isn't usually very popular. In fact, to follow God, to be set aside for His purposes over and against our own, is pretty hard at times. But before we dig into that story, let me catch you up from where we left off in our last session. See, in our last session, we talked about Abram or Abraham and how God had made this promise to give him land and a lot of descendants, and through those descendants to bless the whole world. We saw how God established this covenant with Abram by passing through the split animals himself, cementing the covenant apart from Abram's ability or lack thereof to honor this covenant, that God would fulfill the covenant. And what we see as we move forward from the story of Abraham is that God does exactly that. God gives Abraham a son, Isaac, and God gives Isaac a son, Jacob, and God gives Jacob 12 sons who will ultimately become the 12 tribes of Israel. One of those sons is Joseph. Joseph is an interesting story in and of himself because Joseph is the most loved by his dad, which makes him the most hated by his brothers, and his brothers conspire against Joseph and sell him into slavery. Through a series of events, Joseph becomes the number 2 man in all of Egypt. Joseph works by God's grace and by God's provision to help save Egypt from a pretty severe famine. And then when the famine gets large enough, even his own brothers and dad come to Egypt to benefit from God's saving work through Joseph. Now we have the 12 tribes in Egypt. And they grow. And they become numerous as God promised to Abraham. So numerous, in fact, that at the beginning of Exodus, what we read is that a new Pharaoh has come to power, a Pharaoh who doesn't know the story of Joseph. This Pharaoh looks around his country and realizes that there's a lot of these Israelites here. And he's threatened by them. And so he takes them and he enslaves them and forces them to work for him under phenomenally harsh conditions. They're slaves in Egypt. That leads us to today's session, because in the midst of this slavery, we see another aspect of God's divine rescue plan for creation. See, this time we see a foreshadowing of a Savior. God is going to use a person, Moses, to free his people from slavery. Again, pointing forward to the time when Jesus would come and save all of creation from slavery to sin. But here God is going to free his people from slavery in Egypt. Moses is an interesting character. Moses is born in a time when Israelites were being put to death. Because they were feared, they were being killed off. But Moses' life is saved by being put in a shipped out in the midst of a river. He ends up being raised in Pharaoh's house because Pharaoh's daughter pulls him from the river. Pretty good training for a future redeemer, Savior, so to speak, of God's people. He's raised in Pharaoh's house until he gets enraged and kills an Egyptian. Moses is banned. He flees to Midian, where he lives as a shepherd. It's there in Midian that God comes to him. In Exodus chapter 3, we see God coming to Moses in the form of a burning bush. Let me read a little of this for you. "Come," says God to Moses, "come, and I will send you to Pharaoh that you may bring my people, the children of Israel, out of Egypt." Wow, that's a pretty big calling that God drops on Moses. He says, I'm going to send you back to Egypt, and you're going to be the one to lead my people out of slavery. Moses, by the way, freaks out and offers God all of these excuses why he's not the guy. I can't do it, God. I don't speak very well. I can't do it. I don't know who you are, and the people won't know who you are. And what do I tell them if they ask me? And he gives all of these excuses that God ultimately trumps because Moses is the man for this job. God has set Moses aside for this purpose. And so Moses goes back to Egypt. Can you imagine how Moses must have felt? I mean, at this point, he's a shepherd from Midian. Yeah, he was raised in Egypt, but at this point, he's a shepherd from Midian, dressed like a shepherd, probably smelled like a shepherd, and here he is walking up to face the most powerful person on the planet, the Pharaoh of Egypt. That'd be a little bit like one of us being just a farmer and smelling like we came straight from the barn and suddenly walking up to the President of the United States and saying, hey, we got something to tell you. Everything you're doing is wrong and you need to do this. Pretty intimidating, I think. Moses had to be quaking just a little bit as he goes up to Pharaoh, and yet he has the promise of God to lean on, to lean into. He walks up to Pharaoh and he says, God says to let my people go, and Pharaoh says no, and we read in the book of Exodus this story of how God liberates his people from Egypt. He sends plagues and Pharaoh's heart is hardened, and he sends more plagues and Pharaoh still won't budge, and he sends more plagues and Pharaoh's still not having anything to do with it until finally God sends the final plague, the Passover. When he tells his people, if you trust me, go slaughter a lamb and paint the doorposts of your house and stay inside tonight. My angel of death is going to pass over town. And if you have the blood on the doorpost, then you'll be safe. And if you don't, then your firstborns are going to die. And that night, God passed over the city. And all of the firstborns of the Israelites with the blood on their doorposts were saved, and all of the firstborns without the blood on the doorposts, the Egyptians, were killed. And Pharaoh is broken, and Pharaoh says to Moses, go, take gold, take what you need, just go. And Moses leads God's people out of slavery. Pretty cool stuff. Pretty cool stuff, and yet that's even not the end of the story. As they're leaving, Pharaoh has a change of heart. He sends his army led by him after the Israelites that he has just released from slavery. They pursue them all the way to the shores of the Red Sea, and there God does yet again the miraculous. He parts the water, leads them through. The waves come crashing back down on the Egyptians who have tried to follow the Israelites through. And just like that, God has not only freed his people from slavery, but he has proven that even the strongest, most powerful military person, nation in the world, even they can't stand against his will for his people. God frees his people from slavery. Pretty cool.
Our wiring is to fit in, yet God calls us to be in this world, not of the world. This week, we're going to give you the opportunity to look at those ways that you have chosen to fit into the world and how it's affected your faith life. Have a great time with your family.